Today we have some more actual history from the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754. I think this war is somewhat overlooked by modern historians, probably because they are not very concerned with the hardships that American settlers faced at the hands of Indians in western Pennsylvania and in Virginia. As you will see in the story we are going to read today, basically every settlement on the western frontier of America was in danger of being attacked by Indians, who were paid by the French for every scalp they brought in. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. Today's story is about a man who was called Indian Peter. His real name was Peter Williamson, and he was born near Aberdeen, Scotland around 1730. When he was about 8 years old, he was kidnapped by merchants off the coast of Aberdeen and taken to America, where he was sold into indentured servitude. By the time he was 24 years old, he had gained his freedom and started a new life with his wife in western Pennsylvania, when Indians would attack his home and change the course of his life forever. Sufferings of Peter Williamson, one of the settlers in the back parts of Pennsylvania. Written by himself. I was born within 10 miles of the town of Aberdeen, in the north of Scotland. At 8 years of age, being a sturdy boy, I was taken notice of by two fellows belonging to a vessel, employed as the trade then was, by some of the worthy merchants of Aberdeen, in that villainous and execrable practice of stealing young children from their parents, and selling them as slaves in the plantations abroad, and on board the ship easily cajoled by them, where I was conducted between decks to some others they had kidnapped in the same manner, and in about a month's time they set sail for America. When arrived at Philadelphia, the captain sold us at about 16 pounds per head. What became of my unhappy companions I never knew, but it was my lot to be sold for 7 years to one of my countrymen, who had in his youth been kidnapped like myself, but from another town. Having no children of his own, and commiserating my condition, he took care of me, indulged me in going to school, where I went every winter for 5 years, and made a tolerable proficiency. With this good master I continued until he died, and as a reward for my faithful service, he left me 200 pounds currency, which was then about 120 pounds sterling, and his best horse, saddle, and all his wearing apparel. Being now 17 years old and my own master, having money in my pockets and all other necessaries, I employed myself in jobbing for near 7 years, when I resolved to settle and married the daughter of a substantial planter. My father-in-law made me a deed of gift to a tract of land that lay, unhappily for me, as it since proved, on the frontiers of the province of Pennsylvania, near the forks of Delaware, containing about 200 acres, 30 of which were well cleared and fit for immediate use, on which were a good house and barn. The place pleasing me well, I settled on it. My money I expended in buying stock, household furniture, and implements for out-of-door work, and being happy in a good wife, my felicity was complete. But in 1754, the Indians, who had for a long time before ravaged and destroyed other parts of America unmolested, began now to be very troublesome on the frontier of our province, where they generally appeared in small skulking parties, committing great devastations. Terrible and shocking to human nature were the barbarities daily committed by these Indians. Scarce did a day pass but some unhappy family or other fell victims to savage cruelty. Terrible indeed it proved to me as well as to many others. I that was now happy in an easy state of life, blessed with an affectionate and tender wife, became suddenly one of the most unhappy of mankind. Scarce can I sustain the shock which forever recurs on recollecting the fatal 2nd of October, 1754. My wife that day went from home to visit some of her relations. As I stayed up later than usual expecting her return, no one being in the house besides myself, how great was my surprise and terror when about 11 o'clock at night I heard the dismal war-whoop of the savages, and found that my house was beset by them. I flew to my chamber window and perceived them to be 12 in number. Having my gun loaded, I threatened them with death, if they did not retire. But how vain and fruitless are the efforts of one man against the united force of so many bloodthirsty monsters. One of them that could speak English threatened me in return that if I did not come out they would burn me alive, adding, however, that if I would come out and surrender myself prisoner, they would not kill me. In such deplorable circumstances, I chose to rely on their promises, rather than meet death by rejecting them, and accordingly went out of the house, with my gun in my hand, not knowing that I had it. Immediately on my approach, they rushed on me like tigers, and instantly disarmed me. Having me thus in their power, they bound me to a tree, went into the house, plundered it of everything that they could carry off, and then set fire to it, and consumed what was left before my eyes. Not satisfied with this, they set fire to my barn, stable, and outhouses, wherein were about 200 bushels of wheat, 6 cows, 4 horses, and 5 sheep, all of which were consumed to ashes. Having thus finished the execrable business about which they came, one of the monsters came to me with a tomahawk, and threatened me with the worst of deaths, if I would not go with them. I agreed to go. They then untied me, and gave me a load to carry, under which I traveled all that night, full of the most terrible apprehensions, lest my unhappy wife should likewise have fallen into their cruel power. At daybreak my infernal masters ordered me to lay down my load, when tying my hands again round a tree, they forced the blood out of my fingers' ends, and then seeing them kindling a fire near the tree to which I was bound, the most dreadful agony seized me, from the apprehension that I was going to be made a sacrifice to their barbarity. The fire being made, they for some time danced around me, whooping, hallooing, and shrieking in a frightful manner. Being satisfied with this sort of mirth, they proceeded in another way, taking the burning coals and sticks flaming with fire at the ends, holding them to my face, head, hands, and feet, and at the same time threatening to burn me entirely if I cried out. Thus tortured almost to death, I suffered their brutalities, without being allowed to vent my anguish otherwise than by shedding silent tears. And these being observed, they took fresh coals and applied them near my eyes, telling me that my face was wet, and that they would dry it for me, which indeed they cruelly did. How I underwent these tortures has been a matter of wonder to me, but God enabled me to wait with more than common patience for the deliverance I daily prayed for. At length they sat down around the fire, and roasted the meat of which they had robbed my dwelling. When they had supped, they offered some of it to me. Though it may easily be imagined I had but little appetite to eat, after the tortures and miseries I had suffered, yet was I forced to seem pleased with what they offered me, lest by refusing it they should resume their hellish practices. What I could not eat I contrived to hide, they having unbound me till they imagined I had eaten it all. But then they bound me as before, in which deplorable condition I was forced to continue the whole day. When the sun was set, they put out the fire, and covered with ashes the leaves, as is their custom, that the white people might not discover any traces of their having been there. Going from thence along the Susquehanna for the space of 6 miles, loaded as I was before, we arrived at a spot near the Appalachian Mountains, or Blue Hills, where they hid their plunder under logs of wood. From thence they proceeded to a neighboring house occupied by one Jacob Snyder and his unhappy family, consisting of his wife, 5 children, and a young man, his servant. They soon got admittance into the unfortunate man's house, where they immediately, without the least remorse, scalped both parents and children, nor could the tears, the shrieks, or cries of the poor innocent children prevent their horrid massacre. Having thus scalped them and plundered the house of everything that was movable, they set fire to it, and left the distressed victims amidst the flames. Thinking the young man belonging to this unhappy family would be of service to them in carrying part of the plunder, they spared his life, and loaded him and myself with what they had here got, and again marched to the Blue Hills, where they stowed their goods as before. My fellow sufferer could not support the cruel treatment with which we were obliged to endure, and complaining bitterly to me of his being unable to proceed any further, I endeavored to animate him, but all in vain, for he still continued his moans and tears, which one of the savages perceiving as we traveled along, came up to us, and with his tomahawk gave him a blow on the head, which felled the unhappy youth to the ground, whom they immediately scalped and left. The suddenness of this murder shocked me to such a degree that I was in a manner motionless, expecting my fate would soon be the same. However, recovering my distracted thoughts, I dissembled my anguish as well as I could from the barbarians, but still such was my terror that for some time I scarce knew the days of the week, or what I did. Thus still they kept on their course near the mountains, where they lay skulking 4 or 5 days, rejoicing at the plunder they had got. When provisions became scarce, they made their way towards the Susquehanna, and passed another house inhabited by an old man, whose name was John Adams, with his wife and 4 small children, and meeting no resistance, they immediately scalped the mother and her children before the old man's eyes. Inhuman and horrid as this was, it did not satisfy them, for when they had murdered the poor woman, they acted with her in such a brutal manner as decency will not permit me to mention. The unhappy husband, not being able to avoid the sight, entreated them to put an end to his miserable being, but they were as deaf to the tears and entreaties of this venerable sufferer as they had been to those of the others, and proceeded to burn and destroy his house, barn, corn, hay, cattle, and everything the poor man a few hours before was master of. Having saved what they thought proper from the flames, they gave the old man, feeble, weak, and in the miserable condition he then was, as well as myself, burdens to carry, and loading themselves likewise with bread and meats, pursued their journey toward the great swamp. Here they lay for 8 or 9 days, diverting themselves at times in barbarous cruelties on the old man. Sometimes they would strip him naked, and paint him all over with various sorts of colors. At other times they would pluck the white hairs from his head, and tauntingly tell him that he was a fool for living so long, and that they should show him kindness in putting him out of this world. In vain were all his tears, for daily did they tire themselves with the various means they tried to torment him, sometimes tying him to a tree and whipping him, at other times scorching his furrowed cheeks with red-hot coals, and burning his legs quite to the knees. One night after he had thus been tormented, whilst he and I were condoling each other at the miseries we daily suffered, 25 other Indians arrived, bringing with them 20 scalps and 3 prisoners, who had unhappily fallen into their hands at Conogocheague, a small town near the river Susquehanna, chiefly inhabited by the Irish. These prisoners gave us some shocking accounts of the murders and devastations committed in their parts, a few instances of which will enable the reader to guess at the treatment the provincials have suffered. This party who now joined us had it not, I found, in their power to begin their violences as soon as those who visited my habitation, the first of their tragedies being on the 25th of October, 1754, when John Lewis with his wife and 3 small children were inhumanly scalped and murdered, and his house, barn, and everything he possessed burnt and destroyed. On the 28th of October, Jacob Miller, with his wife and 6 of his family, with everything on his plantation, shared the same fate. On the 30th of October, the house, mill, barn, 20 head of cattle, 2 teams of horses, and everything belonging to George Folk, met with like treatment, himself, wife, and all his miserable family, consisting of 9 in number, being scalped, then cut in pieces, and given to the swine. One of the substantial traders belonging to the province, having business that called him some miles up the country, fell into the hands of these ruffians, who not only scalped him, but immediately roasted him before he was dead. Then, like cannibals, for want of other food, they ate his whole body, and of his head made what they called an Indian pudding. The 3 prisoners that were brought with these additional forces, constantly repining at their lots, and almost dead with their excessively hard treatment, contrived at last to make their escape, but being far from their own settlements and not knowing the country, were soon after met by some other tribes or nations at war with us and brought back. The poor creatures, almost famished for want of sustenance, having had none during this time of their escape, were no sooner in the power of the barbarians than 2 of them were tied to a tree, and a great fire made round them, where they remained until they were terribly scorched and burnt, when one of the villains with his scalping knife ripped open their bellies, took out their entrails, and burned them before their eyes, whilst the others were cutting, piercing, and tearing the flesh from their breast, hands, arms, and legs, with red-hot irons until they were dead. The 3rd unhappy victim was reserved a few hours longer, to be, if possible, sacrificed in a more cruel manner. His arms were tied close to his body, and a hole being dug deep enough for him to stand upright, he was put into it, and earth rammed and beat all round his body, up to his neck, so that his head only appeared above the ground. They then scalped him, and there let him remain for 3 or 4 hours in the greatest agonies, after which they made a small fire near his head, causing him to suffer the most excruciating torments, whilst the poor creature could only cry for mercy by killing him immediately, for his brains were boiling in his head. Inexorable to all he said, they continued the fire, till his eyes gushed out of their sockets. Such agonizing torments did this unhappy creature suffer for near 2 hours before he was quite dead. Then they cut off his head, and buried it with the other bodies. My task being to dig the graves, which, feeble and terrified as I was, the dread of suffering the same fate enabled me to do so. A great snow was now falling. The barbarians were fearful lest the white people should, by their tracks, find out their skulking retreats, which obliged them to make the best of their way to their winter quarters, about 200 miles further from any plantations or inhabitants. After a long and painful journey, being almost starved, I arrived with this infernal crew at Alamingo. Dancing, singing, and shouting were their general amusements, and in all their dances and festivals they relate what successes they have had, and what damages they have sustained in their expeditions, in which I now unhappily became part of their theme. The severity of the cold increasing, they stripped me of my clothes for their own use, and gave me such as they usually wore themselves, being a piece of blanket and a pair of moccasins or shoes, with a yard of coarse cloth to put round me instead of breeches. At Alamingo I remained near 2 months, till the snow was off the ground. Whatever thoughts I might have had of making my escape, to carry them into execution was impracticable, being so far from any plantations or white people, and the severe weather rendering my limbs in a manner quite stiff and motionless. However, I contrived to defend myself against the inclemency of the weather as well as I could, by making myself a little wigwam with the bark of the trees, covering it with earth, which made it resemble a cave, and to prevent the ill effects of the cold, I kept a good fire always near the door. My liberty of going about was indeed more than I could have expected, but they well knew the impracticability of my escaping from them. Seeing me outwardly easy and submissive, they would sometimes give me a little meat, but my chief food was Indian corn. At length the time came when they were preparing themselves for another expedition against the planters and white people. But before they set out, they were joined by many other Indians. As soon as the snow was quite gone, they set forth on their journey towards the back parts of the province of Pennsylvania, all leaving their wives and children behind in their wigwams. They were now a formidable body, amounting to near 150. My business was to carry what they thought proper to load me with, but they never entrusted me with a gun. We marched on several days without anything particular occurring. For my part, I had nothing but a few ears of Indian corn, with which I was glad to eat dry, nor did the Indians themselves fare much better, but as we drew near the plantations they were afraid to kill any game, lest the noise of their guns should alarm the inhabitants. When we arrived at the Blue Hills, about 30 miles from the Irish settlements before mentioned, we encamped for 3 days, though God knows we had neither tents nor anything else to defend us from the inclemency of the air, having nothing to lie on by night but the grass. During our stay here a sort of council of war was held, when it was agreed to divide themselves into companies of about 20 men each, after which every captain marched with his party where he thought proper. I still belonged to my old masters, but was left behind on the mountains with 10 Indians, to stay till the rest should return, not thinking it proper to carry me to Conococheague or other plantations. Here I began to meditate an escape, and though I knew the country around very well, yet I was very cautious of giving the least suspicion of any such intention. However, the 3rd day after the grand party left us, my companions thought proper to traverse the mountains in search of game for their subsistence, leaving me bound in such a manner that I could not escape. At night, when they returned, having unbound me, we all sat down together to supper on what they had killed, and soon after, being greatly fatigued with their day's excursion, they composed themselves to rest as usual. I now tried various ways to discover whether it was a scheme to prove my intentions or not, but after making a noise and walking about, sometimes touching them with my feet, I found there was no pretense. Then I resolved, if possible, to get one of their guns, and if discovered, to die in my defense rather than to be taken. For that purpose I made various efforts to get one from under their heads, where they always secured them, but in vain. Disappointed in this, I began to despair at carrying my designs into execution. Yet after a little recollection, and trusting myself to the divine protection, I sat forward naked and defenseless as I was. Such was my terror, however, that in going from them I halted, and paused every 4 or 5 yards, looking fearfully towards the spot where I had left them, lest they should awake and miss me. But when I was 200 yards from them, I mended my pace, and made as much haste as I possibly could to the foot of the mountains, when on a sudden I was struck with the greatest terror on hearing the wood cry, as it was called, which the savages I had left were making, upon their missing their charge. The more my terror increased, the faster I pushed on, and scarce knowing where I trod, drove through the woods with the utmost precipitation, sometimes falling and bruising myself, cutting my feet and legs against the stones in a miserable manner. But faint and maimed as I was, I continued my flight until daybreak, when, without having anything to sustain nature but a little corn left, I crept into a hollow tree, where I lay very snug, and returned my thanks to the divine being that had thus far favored my escape. But my repose was in a few hours destroyed at hearing the voices of the Indians near the place where I was hid, threatening and talking how they would use me if they got me again. However, they at last left the spot where I heard them, and I remained in my apartment all day without further molestation. At night I ventured forward again, frightened, thinking each twig that touched me was a savage. The third day I concealed myself in like manner as before, and at night traveled, keeping off the main road as much as possible, which lengthened my journey many miles. But how shall I describe the terror I felt on the 4th night, when, by the rustling I made among the leaves, a party of Indians that lay round a small fire, which I did not perceive, started from the ground, and, seizing their arms, ran from the fire amongst the woods. Whether to move forward or rest where I was, I knew not. Then, to my great surprise and joy, I was relieved by a parcel of swine that made towards the place where I guessed the savages to be, who, on seeing them, imagined that they had caused the alarm, very merrily returned to the fire, and lay again down to sleep. Bruised, crippled, and terrified as I was, I pursued my journey till break of day, when, thinking myself safe, I lay down under a great log, and slept until about noon. Before evening I reached the summit of a great hill, and looking out if I could spy any habitations of white people, to my inexpressible joy, I saw some which I guessed to be about 10 miles distant. In the morning I continued my journey towards the nearest cleared lands I had seen the day before, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon arrived at the house of John Bell, an old acquaintance, where, knocking at the door, his wife, who opened it, seeing me in such a frightful condition, flew from me screaming into the house. This alarmed the whole family, who immediately fled to their arms, and I was soon accosted by the master with his gun in his hand. But on making myself known, for he before took me to be an Indian, he immediately caressed me, as did all his family, with extraordinary friendship, the report of my being murdered by the savages having reached them some months before. For 2 days and nights they very affectionately supplied me with all the necessaries, and carefully attended me till my spirits and limbs were pretty well recovered, and I thought myself able to ride, when I borrowed of these good people a horse and some clothes, and set forward for my father-in-law's house in Chester County, about 140 miles thence, where I arrived on the 4th of January 1755, but scarce one of the family could credit their eyes, believing with the people that I had lately left, that I had fallen a prey to the Indians, where I was received and embraced by the whole family with great affection. Upon inquiring for my dear wife, I found that she had been dead 2 months. This fatal news greatly lessened the joy I otherwise should have felt, and my deliverance from the dreadful state and company that I had been in. So that's it for this episode about the captivity of Indian Peter. After his return from captivity, he enlisted in an army regiment to fight in the French and Indian War. He would then be captured by French troops and marched to Quebec, where he was exchanged for other prisoners and sent back to England, arriving in Plymouth in 1756. He would then return to Scotland. He was called Indian Peter after he wrote a book documenting his capture as a boy into indentured servitude, as well as his time of Indian captivity. He would dress up in Indian clothing to sell his book on the streets of Aberdeen. Many people claimed that his story was false, but these were probably people who did not want Peter to share his story about being abducted by Aberdeen merchants as a boy. He later won legal cases against the Aberdeen magistrates, as well as some of the men personally involved in his kidnapping. Some modern historians doubt the authenticity of the narrative of Peter's captivity. One historian said in a 1964 article that Williamson was one of the greatest liars who ever lived. Feel free to comment below about whether you think Indian Peter's story is true. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to show or talk about on history channels on TV. Our mission on this channel is to keep this worthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission here at Unworthy History, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. We now have a total of 10 members-only videos that you will have access to as a channel member, including our newest video about the 1807 massacre of the Jordan family in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. Members will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.